to Deep Sleep Stories. If these stories have helped you through restless nights, please leave a review. Reviews are what help this podcast grow, reach more listeners, and stay alive. Without them, even something meaningful can slowly disappear. So if this show has brought you comfort, that small act truly helps keep it going. Now, settle in, and let's begin.
Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, where the day can gently loosen its grip and your thoughts can drift like soft clouds across a quiet sky. Tonight's tale is about Windchimes and the Drizzle and how their tender music can guide a weary heart into a peaceful, dreamy rest. Settle in exactly as you are. Let your body find the shape of comfort. Feel the way the surface beneath you offers steady support, holding you without asking anything in return. If it helps, allow your shoulders to soften, your jaw to unclench, your forehead to smooth as though a warm hand has passed across it. Take a slow breath in, as if you're sipping calm through a straw, and let it out, longer than the inhale, like a sigh that slides down a window pane. Again, a gentle inhale, cool and clean, and a slow exhale, letting the day drain away. Imagine, just for now, that outside your room there is a small porch, and beyond it a garden where everything is muted by evening. The light is dim and kind. The air smells faintly of rain and damp leaves, of earth that has been cooled and comforted. Somewhere nearby, a soft drizzle is falling, not hurried, not heavy. It's the sort of rain that feels like a whisper, as if the sky is speaking in a language only the quiet parts of you can understand. As you breathe, you may begin to notice a delicate sound, a small, bright chiming that comes and goes. Wind chimes stirred by the lightest movements of air. Their notes are simple, clear, and slow. They don't demand attention. They simply appear, and then they fade, like thoughts that have learned not to cling. With every breath, you can let go a little more. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing you have to solve. Let the story carry you gently, the way drizzle carries a fragrance through the night. And now, while your breathing continues to settle into an easy rhythm, the viewpoint shifts so you can rest even more deeply as the story begins to unfold. In a small village tucked between rolling hills and a wide, quiet river, there stood a cottage with a roof the color of moss and a garden that always looked a little bit like a painting left out in the mist. The cottage was not grand. It had no towers and no gates, no impressive stonework meant to announce importance. Instead, it had windows that glowed warmly when night arrived, and a front porch that seemed to welcome anyone who came near, even if they never stepped onto its boards. On that porch, hanging from a beam, darkened by time and rain, there was a set of wind chimes. They were not expensive. The pieces were a mix of weathered metal and smooth driftwood, with a small round disc at the center that had been etched by hand. If someone looked closely, they might notice the faint pattern on that disc, a spiral that turned inward like a sleepy shell, or like a path that led somewhere peaceful. Whenever a breeze passed through, the chimes answered. Their sound was clear but gentle, bright but never sharp. They seemed to know exactly how loud to be, as though they had learned the art of kindness. This evening a drizzle had arrived, the kind that made the world glossy and soft around the edges. The clouds sat low and the village street lamps wore halos of mist. Everything had slowed. Doors were closed. Kettles were set to simmer. And the river beyond the hills moved like a long ribbon of ink. Inside the cottage, a person named Elowen moved quietly from room to room. Her footsteps were light, not because she was trying to hide, but because she had lived here long enough to know the house's sleepy creaks, and she preferred not to startle them. Elowen kept the cottage the way some people keep a favorite book, well-loved, familiar, with corners softened by use. A basket of folded blankets rested by the hearth. A jar of dried herbs sat near the window. A small wooden table held a ceramic bowl filled with smooth stones collected from the riverbank. Stones that felt cool and comforting in the palm. She paused at the kitchen counter where a teapot released faint curls of steam. She poured a little into a cup and held it between her hands, letting warmth seep into her fingers, spaced with generous silence. The sound spaced with generous silence. The sound traveled through the open crack of the kitchen window and into the cottage, as if the night itself had sent a lullaby. Elowen listened. She always listened. In the village, people sometimes spoke of her in the gentle way one speaks of someone who is a little different, but not in a frightening way. They said she could hear weather the way others heard music. They said she knew when fog would come, before the first thin veil even appeared. They said her garden bloomed as though it received instructions from the moon. Elowen never corrected anyone. She let their stories sit where they landed. What was true was simpler and quieter. She had a relationship with small sounds, the hush of a candle being snuffed, the flutter of a moth's wings against a window pane, the soft clink of a spoon in a cup, and of course the wind chimes, those patient little bells that turned even the faintest breeze into something you could hear. This cottage had belonged to her aunt once, long ago, back when Elowen was still learning how to move through the world. Her aunt had been the one to hang the wind chimes, explaining with a smile that always seemed half amused by secrets that they weren't just decoration. They remind the air to be gentle, her aunt had said, and they remind us too. Elowen remembered that line now as she set her cup down and walked toward the front door. The cottage felt especially cozy when the drizzle came. The rain's quiet insistence made everything indoors feel more sheltered, more intimate, as though the outside world had wrapped itself in a blanket and lowered its voice. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and fresh. The scent of wet earth rose from the garden beds below, rich and comforting. Leaves glistened with a thin sheen of water, and the stone path leading from the porch disappeared into a soft haze. The wind chimes hung just above her head, swaying with the smallest movements. droplets clung to the metal and wood, catching what little light existed. Each time the chimes touched, they made a note that seemed to bloom into the air and then vanish, leaving behind a lingering sense of calm. Aloan lifted a hand and gently steadied the chimes, feeling their coolness against her fingertips. The drizzle continued. It was not cold enough to sting, not heavy enough to soak her quickly. It simply existed like a quiet companion. Beyond the garden, the village sat in its evening stillness. Curtains were drawn in many windows, but a few squares of amber light remained, like friendly eyes. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. Somewhere a door clicked shut. The world was settling. Aloan's gaze drifted to the far end of her garden, where a small arbor stood, half covered in climbing vines. A lantern hung there, unlit, its glass speckled with rain. The arbor marked the beginning of a narrow footpath that led away from the cottage through a stand of willow trees and down toward the river. She had walked that path so many times she could have done it with her eyes closed. Yet tonight, she felt a quiet pull toward it, the way one might feel called to stand beneath a familiar tree or open a well-loved book to a page that always brings comfort. The wind chimes rang again, a gentle sequence of notes that sounded oddly like an invitation. Aloan smiled, small and sleepy. She stepped back inside, fetched a light cloak from a hook by the door, and returned to the porch. Before she left, she took a moment to listen again, letting the chimes' slow music settle her thoughts. Then she walked down the garden path. The drizzle followed her, soft and constant. It darkened the edges of petals and made the air shimmer. The garden itself looked dreamlike, as though it belonged to a world slightly adjacent to waking. Each plant held droplets like tiny lanterns. The herb beds released their scent more strongly in the damp. Lavender, rosemary, mint, all blending into a calming, earthy perfume. Aloan moved without hurry. There was no reason to rush. The night would hold her as long as she needed. At the arbor, she paused and touched the lantern. She didn't light it. The village's glow behind her and the pale brightness of clouded sky offered enough. Besides, she liked the way darkness softened everything, turning sharp outlines into gentle suggestions. She stepped beneath the arbor and onto the narrow path. The willows ahead were already waiting, their long branches hanging like curtains. Rain slid from their leaves in slow drops. The path curved beneath them, and for a moment it felt as though Aloan had entered a quiet green room, a secret place meant only for listening. There the sounds of the village faded. The world narrowed to the hush of drizzle, the sigh of willow leaves, the soft press of earth underfoot. And then, faintly, came the sound of wind chimes again. Aloan stopped. She had left her chimes on the porch. The notes she heard now were different, lower perhaps, and spaced with even more silence. They seemed to come from somewhere ahead, somewhere near the river. She listened carefully. The sound returned, a soft chiming that drifted through the willows, like a thread of music. Elowen felt her chest loosen as if some small knot she hadn't noticed was untangling. She followed the sound. The path wound gently downhill. The air cooled as she neared the river, and the smell shifted from garden earth to wet stones and clean water. Somewhere nearby, a frog made a quiet, content sound, then stilled again. The chimes rang once more. Elowen stepped out from under the willows and found herself at the riverbank. The river was wide here, moving slowly, its surface disturbed by drizzle in a pattern of endless tiny circles. The far bank was obscured by mist. The water looked like a dark mirror that had been touched softly by many fingertips. Near the edge of the river, a small wooden footbridge stretched across a narrow inlet. It was old but sturdy, its planks dark with rain. At the far end of the bridge stood a slender post, and from the post hung a set of wind chimes. Elowen had never seen them before. They were similar to hers in spirit, though not in shape. These chimes were made of thin, pale metal that caught what little light existed and reflected it back in muted glimmers. Between the hanging pieces were small beads that looked like river pearls, soft and cloudy. The chimes moved in the slightest breeze, ringing in a voice that seemed to blend perfectly with the sound of rain on water. Elowen approached the bridge slowly, feeling as though she was stepping into a dream that had been waiting for her. She placed one foot on the first plank, then the next, the wood giving a gentle creak under her weight. Halfway across, she paused and listened. The chime's notes seemed to open space in the air. Each tone arrived, hovered, and then faded into the drizzle. It was not music meant to entertain. It was music meant to soothe, to make room for quiet. Elowen reached the far end of the bridge and stood beneath the chimes. The post was wrapped in twine as though someone had cared for it, and at its base lay a small flat stone, smooth and pale. On the stone there was a message, no words, just a simple carved spiral, like the one on her own chimes. Turning inward, Elowen's breath slowed. She knelt and traced the spiral with a fingertip. The stone was cool and comforting. A soft breeze moved through and the chimes rang again. This time, the sound felt closer, not just to her ears, but to the space behind her ribs. It was as though the notes had slipped inside and were gently rearranging her thoughts, making them less tangled, more spacious. The drizzle continued, unbothered. Elowen rose slowly, standing beneath the chimes. She looked out over the river and let herself simply be there. No plans, no questions, just presence. As she listened, something subtle happened. The mist over the river shifted. Not dramatically, not like a curtain being pulled aside, but like a slow exhale. The far bank became slightly clearer. Shapes emerged, trees, stones, the suggestion of a narrow trail that ran along the water. And on that far bank, there was a small light. It wasn't bright, it was the sort of light that might come from a lantern turned low or from a candle placed behind frosted glass. It hovered in the mist as though uncertain whether it should be seen. Elowen's gaze rested on it, calm and curious. The chimes rang again, and the notes seemed to lean toward the light, as if they recognized it. Without deciding too firmly, without making it into a task, Elowen stepped forward. The bridge led to the far side. There were stones set into the shallow water beyond, a path designed for feet that didn't mind a little damp. She crossed carefully, her cloak catching a few extra droplets. The river's edge felt colder here, but not unpleasant, just fresh. The stones underfoot were slick but stable. Elowen moved slowly, letting her body find balance with ease. On the far bank, the air seemed thicker with quiet. The drizzle was the same, yet everything felt softer, more hushed, as though the world had dimmed its lights. The small light remained ahead, nestled near the base of a tree whose branches stretched out like open hands. As Elowen approached, she realized the light came from a lantern hanging low on a branch. Beneath that lantern sat a small shelter made of woven reeds and branches, something between a tiny pavilion and a bird's nest scaled up for a person. It was no taller than Elowen's shoulders. Its entrance was open, inviting, and inside there were cushions covered in fabric that looked like it had been dyed with rainwater and twilight. Wind chimes hung at the entrance. These chimes were the smallest yet. Thin pieces of glass, pale as moonlight, clinked softly as the drizzle tapped them. Their sound was barely there, like a thought that doesn't want to interrupt. Elowen stood at the threshold and listened. The chimes on the bridge rang faintly behind her, carried by the breeze across the water. The glass chimes at the shelter answered in delicate whispers. It felt like a conversation made of sound and air and rain. Elowen stepped inside. The shelter smelled faintly of dried grass and clean wood. The cushions welcomed her weight with gentle give. She pulled her cloak tighter and settled into a comfortable position, knees drawn slightly in, hands resting loosely in her lap. The lantern's light was warm and low. It made the drizzle outside look like strands of silver falling through darkness. Elowen did not feel afraid. The place felt meant for rest. As she listened to the chimes, she noticed something else, a rhythm beneath the notes, like a slow heartbeat. Perhaps it was her own. Perhaps it was the river's steady movement. Perhaps it was the sound of rain on leaves, repeating and repeating, comforting in its constancy. She let her eyes half close. The chime's notes became softer. The spaces between them widened. In those spaces, Elowen's thoughts began to drift, not in sharp lines, but in slow, rounded shapes. She remembered her aunt's hands tying knots in twine. She remembered afternoons when the sky threatened rain and then decided to deliver it gently. She remembered the feeling of being safe indoors while weather moved outside. The chimes sounded again, a sequence of tones that felt like steps on a path. Each note a footfall, each silence a pause to breathe. And then, as though the sound itself had opened a door, Elowen's imagination began to wander. In her mind's eye, the drizzle became a soft veil, and the chimes became keys, turning in invisible locks. The shelter around her seemed to expand, not physically but in feeling, until it was not just a small woven space, but an entire quiet room made of rain-scented air. In that room there were other wind chimes. They hung from branches, from rafters, from threads of light. Each set had a different voice. Some sounded like distant bells, some like soft stones clicking together, some like a sigh made musical. Elowen didn't need to understand why. She didn't need to label it as magic or dream. It was enough that it felt soothing. A breeze moved through the imagined room, and the chimes responded in gentle waves. The sound was layered but never overwhelming. It was like listening to rain in a forest. Many tiny sounds, all blending into calm. In the center of the room, there was a bowl of water. The surface of the water was perfectly still despite the movement of air. Above it hung a single chime, a small ring of metal that, when it moved, made one clear note. That note rang, and the water in the bowl rippled outward in slow circles. Elowen watched, relaxed, as the circles widened, and within them she saw scenes like reflections. A porch in Drizzle, her own porch, with her own wind chimes swinging gently, a garden path glistening with rain, a willow tree dropping soft beads of water into the river. Each scene appeared and then softened, dissolving back into the quiet surface. The chime above the bowl rang again, and the reflection changed. Now the water showed a narrow lane in the village, empty at night, lit by a single lamp. Puddles shimmered on cobblestones. A cat moved silently along a wall, then disappeared into shadow. The scene was peaceful. The drizzle made everything look clean, as though the world had been washed and left to dry under moonlight. The chime rang again. This time the reflection became a room filled with books and blankets. A hearth glowed low. A person sat in a chair, head tilted back, eyes closed, listening to the rain beyond the window. The scene felt like comfort itself. Elowen's breathing slowed more. Her shoulders softened further. The imagined chimes continued their gentle music, and it felt as though the sound was smoothing the edges of every lingering worry. In this dreamy space, there was no need to do anything. Listening was enough. The drizzle outside the shelter continued, steady and patient. The lantern's light flickered slightly, not from wind, there was hardly any, but from the gentle movement of air that always exists, as if the world is constantly breathing. Elowen's eyelids grew heavier. At the entrance of the shelter, the small glass chimes clinked faintly, nudged by a breeze that slipped in and out like a quiet guest. Their sound reminded her of tiny drops meeting a pond, each one making a soft, round note. Across the water, the bridge chimes rang once, then fell silent, then rang again, as though they were keeping watch. Elowen's mind drifted deeper, like a leaf floating down a slow stream. She imagined the chimes were not just objects, but gentle guardians of rest. They took the restless energy in the air and turned it into music, They took the heaviness of unspoken thoughts and made them lighter, letting them rise and dissolve. In her imagination, the chimes had a purpose, not to wake anyone, not to call attention, but to guide the world towards softness. A breeze stirred again, and the layered music of chimes felt like a slow tide. In that tide, Elowen sensed something tender, the idea that every sound could be a doorway to calm if approached gently. The patter of drizzle on leaves, the distant murmur of water moving, the faint creak of wood, the quiet hush between one breath and the next. All of it belonged to the same lullaby. Elowen's head leaned back against a cushion, her hands loosened in her lap. Her body became heavy in the most pleasant way, as if gravity had turned into a warm blanket instead of a pull. Outside, the drizzle softened further, becoming almost mist. The air smelled even cleaner. The river's surface was a dark velvet, dotted with tiny rings that appeared and vanished. The lantern's light seemed to dim, not because it was going out, but because night was deepening and everything was turning inward. The chimes rang less often now. When they did, the notes were slower, lower, as though the world was speaking in a whisper. Elowen's thoughts became fewer. A few drifted by, gentle and unimportant. An image of her garden, a memory of her aunt's smile, the feel of warm tea in her hands. Each thought arrived softly and then drifted away, without effort, like a cloud passing across the moon. In the shelter, the air was still and safe. Beyond it, the river continued its slow journey. Above it, the sky held its drizzle like a kind promise. The chimes at the entrance made one final delicate clink, then rested. Elowen's breathing was deep, now smooth and even. Her face had softened into the calm expression of someone who has stopped holding the world up on their shoulders. The night watched over her kindly, and somewhere, perhaps on her porch, back at the cottage, her own wind chimes swayed in the faintest breeze, answering the drizzle with their patient, gentle song. Now the story itself begins to quiet. The river keeps moving, but its sound is far away. The drizzle becomes a soft hush. The chimes are mostly still. Elowen remains curled in warmth and safety, breathing slowly, as though each breath is a small wave, washing calm through her body. The lantern's light is low and sleepy. The mist around the shelter is thick, like a blanket of air. Everything is unhurried. Everything is soft. In the quiet, there is room for rest. No thoughts need solving, no plans need making. Only this gentle sinking into comfort, as if the night is holding the world in its hands. The drizzle fades to a whisper. The last little sound is a distant, tender chime, and then silence, wide and kind. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well.